In medieval mountain regions, survival was shaped by limits rather than choice. Thin soil, steep slopes, and long winters made wheat unreliable, sometimes impossible. Communities could not depend on distant trade or fragile harvests. They needed food that matched the land itself. Chestnut trees quietly answered that need, providing calories, stability, and continuity where conventional grains failed. I find it telling that resilience here came not from innovation, but from acceptance of nature's boundaries. In medieval mountain regions, agriculture was defined by constraint rather than choice. Steep slopes limited the use of ploughs and draft animals, forcing farmers to rely on small terraces or hand cultivation. Soil was often thin, rocky, and easily eroded, unable to support demanding cereal crops such as wheat or rye for long. Even when fields were carefully maintained, yields remained low and unpredictable. Climate added another layer of difficulty. Higher elevations experienced shorter growing seasons, late frosts in spring, and early snowfall in autumn. A single cold snap could destroy months of labour. Grain crops, which required stable conditions and precise timing, frequently failed under these circumstances. For mountain communities, a poor harvest was not an exception, but a recurring risk. Isolation intensified these problems. Many villages were far from major trade routes, connected only by narrow paths that became impassable in winter. Imported grain was expensive, unreliable, or simply unavailable during times of scarcity. As a result, survival depended largely on local food systems rather than external supply. What mattered most was not maximizing yield, but minimizing risk. Mountain farmers needed food sources that could tolerate poor soil, resist cold, and recover from environmental stress. The limitations of the landscape forced people to rethink what staple food meant. Instead of fields of grain, survival increasingly depended on resources that could grow where ploughs could not and endure conditions that crops could not survive. Chestnut trees were uniquely suited to these harsh mountain environments. Unlike grain crops, they did not require flat land or deep, fertile soil. Their roots anchored well into slopes, stabilizing the ground while drawing nutrients from areas unsuitable for agriculture. Once established, chestnut groves required relatively little yearly intervention compared to annual crops. Chestnut trees were also resilient to cold and variable weather. While frost could devastate grain fields, chestnut trees endured seasonal fluctuations and continued producing reliable harvests year after year. Even when one season was poor, mature trees often recovered without the need for replanting, offering long-term stability rather than short-term abundance. Another crucial advantage was predictability. Chestnuts produced consistent yields that families could plan around. In an environment where uncertainty dominated daily life, this reliability mattered deeply. A known harvest reduced anxiety and allowed communities to organize labor, storage, and consumption more effectively. I can sense why these trees inspired trust. In landscapes where crops often failed without warning, chestnuts did not promise wealth or surplus. They promised continuity. That quiet dependability likely mattered more than productivity, shaping a relationship between people and trees built on patience rather than expectation. For medieval mountain communities, chestnuts functioned as a practical substitute for grain rather than a luxury food. Nutritionally, they were rich in carbohydrates, providing the energy required for daily labor in cold and physically demanding environments. While lower in protein than some cereals, chestnuts supplied steady calories that sustained shepherds, woodcutters, and farmers through long workdays. What made chestnuts especially valuable was their reliability as an energy source. Grain harvests fluctuated sharply with weather conditions, but chestnut yields were comparatively stable once trees matured. This meant households could plan their diets around a predictable calorie base, reducing the risk of sudden shortages. In times when bread was scarce or absent, chestnuts filled the same role of keeping bodies fueled. Chestnuts were also gentle on digestion and suitable for all ages. Children, the elderly, and the sick could consume them easily, whether boiled, mashed, or ground. This adaptability strengthened their role as a staple rather than a supplemental food. From a survival perspective, chestnuts balanced adequacy with endurance. They did not create abundance, but they prevented collapse. In environments where food security depended on consistency rather than surplus, chestnuts offered a dependable nutritional anchor. They allowed mountain societies to maintain daily life without relying on fragile grain systems unsuited to their terrain. Another reason chestnuts became central to mountain diets was their versatility in preparation. They could be roasted over open fires, boiled in simple pots, or dried and ground into flour. These methods required minimal equipment, fitting well with households that lacked specialized ovens or mills. Chestnut flour played a particularly important role. Once dried and stored, chestnuts could be transformed into bread-like loaves, porridges, or thick soups. These dishes resembled grain-based foods in function, even if their taste and texture differed. This allowed communities to preserve familiar eating patterns despite the absence of wheat or rye. Chestnuts also combined easily with other local foods. Mixed with dairy, vegetables, or wild herbs, they formed filling meals that balanced available nutrients. Their mild flavour made them adaptable rather than dominant, fitting naturally into everyday cooking rather than standing apart as a special ingredient. Importantly, preparation techniques were passed down through generations. Knowledge of drying times, storage methods, and grinding practices ensured that chestnuts remained edible and safe throughout the year. This culinary flexibility reduced waste and maximised usefulness. In an environment defined by limited tools and resources, chestnuts succeeded because they asked little and offered much. Their ease of preparation reinforced their place as a dependable foundation of daily meals rather than an occasional supplement. Chestnuts fit naturally into the seasonal rhythm of medieval mountain life. Harvesting took place in autumn, a crucial moment before winter closed mountain passes and halted most agricultural activity. Families gathered fallen chestnuts from forest floors, often over several weeks, timing their work around weather and ripening cycles. This seasonal concentration of labour allowed communities to secure a large portion of their annual food supply in a short window. What made chestnuts especially valuable was their capacity for preservation. Fresh chestnuts could be eaten immediately, but most were dried to ensure long-term use. Drying reduced spoilage and weight, making storage easier in damp mountain climates. Once preserved, chestnuts could last through winter and into spring, bridging the most dangerous months of food scarcity. Dried chestnuts were not an end product, but a reserve. They could be rehydrated, ground into flour, or slowly incorporated into meals as needed. This flexibility turned a single harvest into a year-round resource. Unlike grain, which required careful milling and storage infrastructure, chestnuts offered a simpler but reliable system. Seasonal storage reduced dependence on precise timing. If weather disrupted other crops, chestnut reserves remained. In survival terms, this mattered deeply. Chestnuts transformed autumn abundance into winter security, reinforcing their role not as emergency food, but as a planned foundation of endurance. Chestnut cultivation and harvesting were rarely solitary activities. In many mountain regions, chestnut groves functioned as shared resources, managed collectively rather than individually. Harvesting required coordination, mutual respect, and shared rules to prevent conflict and overuse. This collective labour strengthened social bonds while ensuring fair access to food. Knowledge surrounding chestnuts was passed down through generations. Families taught children when to harvest, how to dry nuts properly, and how to store them safely. These practices were not written instructions but lived traditions, reinforced each year through repetition. Food knowledge became cultural memory. Communal processing often followed the harvest. Drying houses, shared ovens, and grinding spaces brought people together during colder months. Work became social, and survival became collective rather than individual. In isolated environments, this cooperation reduced risk and loneliness alike. I feel that chestnuts were more than nourishment. They shaped how people depended on one another. Survival in the mountains was rarely achieved alone, and chestnuts quietly encouraged cooperation, patience, and shared responsibility. In that sense, they fed not only bodies, but the social fabric that made endurance possible. Medieval mountain villages were often distant from major trade networks. Roads were narrow, seasonal, and vulnerable to weather, making regular transport of grain difficult and expensive. During winter, many routes became completely impassable. Under these conditions, reliance on imported food was risky and often unrealistic. Chestnuts offered a solution rooted in local self-sufficiency. Because they grew within or near settlements, communities were not dependent on external markets to secure their staple calories. This autonomy reduced vulnerability to price fluctuations, political instability, or regional shortages that could disrupt grain supplies elsewhere. Unlike grain, which required mills and transport infrastructure, chestnuts could be processed locally with simple tools. This lowered dependence on specialized craftsmen or centralized facilities. Households retained control over both production and preparation, reinforcing resilience in isolated settings. Local food systems based on chestnuts also encouraged long-term stewardship of the landscape. Trees required years to mature, encouraging sustainable thinking rather than short-term exploitation. This contrasted with grain farming, which demanded constant yearly inputs and offered little buffer against failure. In economic terms, chestnuts reduced exposure to scarcity beyond the village. In survival terms, they reduced anxiety. Food security did not hinge on distant markets or uncertain paths through the mountains, but on resources people could see, tend, and trust within their own environment. Winter posed the greatest threat to survival in medieval mountain regions. Cold restricted movement, halted agriculture, and increased caloric needs. Food shortages during this period were not unusual but expected. Chestnuts helped soften this seasonal danger by providing a stable reserve when other foods disappeared. Because chestnuts could be dried and stored, they acted as a buffer against sudden scarcity. Communities were less reliant on a single harvest moment. If other crops failed or livestock numbers dropped, chestnut stores helped absorb the shock. This diversification reduced the likelihood of famine caused by one bad season. Chestnuts also supported rationing strategies. Their predictable availability allowed households to plan consumption carefully across winter months. Meals might be simple, repetitive, and modest, but they remained consistent. That consistency preserved strength and morale during prolonged hardship. I am struck by how quietly effective this system was. There was no dramatic surplus, only enough. Chestnuts did not eliminate hardship, but they reduced desperation. In a harsh environment, that difference mattered. By lowering the risk of sudden hunger, chestnuts gave mountain communities something invaluable: time to endure until spring returned. In medieval mountain regions, chestnuts were not reserved for emergencies or periods of famine. They were part of everyday life. Meals built around chestnuts appeared regularly, shaping daily routines rather than interrupting them. This normality mattered. Foods eaten consistently become trusted, predictable, and emotionally familiar. Chestnuts were consumed in simple forms, boiled, mashed, or mixed into basic dishes. Their presence reduced the need for variety, which was often unattainable anyway. Instead of seeking diversity, households focused on reliability. Eating the same food repeatedly was not seen as deprivation, but as stability. Because chestnuts filled the same functional role as bread or porridge, they defined portion sizes, meal timing, and expectations of fullness. Children grew up accustomed to their taste and texture. Adults measured energy and labor around them. Over time, chestnuts stopped being an alternative to grain and became the standard. This normalization shaped cultural attitudes toward food. Satisfaction came from adequacy rather than indulgence. Hunger was managed through routine, not rescue. In this way, chestnuts influenced not only nutrition but mindset. They reinforced an acceptance of simplicity that aligned closely with mountain life. When a food becomes invisible through familiarity, it has succeeded as a staple. Chestnuts reached that point. They were no longer noticed as a solution to hardship, but simply as what people ate, day after day, season after season. Chestnuts sustained life where grain could not. Their success was not based on high yields or economic value, but on compatibility with the environment. In medieval mountain regions, survival depended less on forcing productivity and more on choosing what endured. Adaptation mattered more than efficiency. Chestnut trees thrived because people allowed the landscape to guide their choices. Rather than reshaping the mountains to suit wheat, communities reshaped their diets to suit the mountains. This flexibility created long-term stability. I am struck by how deliberate this acceptance was. There is quiet wisdom in working with limitations instead of resisting them. Chestnuts remind me that resilience often comes from restraint, not ambition. This history offers a clear message for today. Food security is not about universal solutions or maximum output. It is about understanding local conditions, respecting ecological boundaries, and building systems that last. Medieval mountain communities survived not because they had more, but because they chose what fit.